Good morning, everyone. Sounds like we got a little Rolling Stones going. That's good. A little energy, pump everybody up for the day. Welcome and happy Wednesday to everyone. My name is David Severance. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the leadership coach here. Delighted to have you with us again for our third session here on the Playbook. Good morning from Retreat headquarters, Atlanta. Great. Looking forward to seeing some of you in Atlanta. I hope you can all make it. We've got some plans to be there. We hope that we can see many of you there with us. So we're going to take another dive here into the practice of effective leadership. Looking forward to taking things a step further from where they were last week when we were talking about this process and the effective execution of performance management. One of the most important aspects of leadership is your ability to inspire, motivate, support, and otherwise enable the people on your team to perform at the greatest possible level that they're capable of. The greater productivity you have, the greater efficiency you have, the greater motivation that they have for the work, all serves the business. And so we're spending this particular month thinking about how can you as a leader help support them to be as productive as possible. So we've talked about a couple of things this week up to now, and we're going to continue this. We're going to take it all a step further this week. So let me start by asking you a question. Just put a yes in the chat box. Have you ever, or do you anticipate having the need to have a really effective heart-to-heart conversation with someone on your team when their performance is below expectation or below standard? If that's you, put a yes in there. All right, got it. It's a fairly common occurrence. Sooner or later, when you have people on your team, you're going to face a situation where somebody's not performing as you expect. Question is, what do you do at that particular time? Many of us know that we need to have some kind of a conversation about it, but many of us hesitate to do so because don't want to have conflicts. I'm not sure how to start the conversation. Maybe this person is a friend of ours as well as a business associate. There are a lot of ways that the conversation could go bad. And so we end up not having the conversation. What we're going to do today is give you a script that you can use to help you navigate through a conversation like this in a way that data shows is really effective in helping a person hear what it is you have to say and be willing to collaborate with you on your terms going forward, not theirs. Of course, nothing's foolproof. When you're talking about human beings, there are no guarantees. But you want to make sure you have certain practices that are part of that conversation. If you have them in place and you move through them, then you're giving yourself the best possible opportunity to get the right performance and commitment out of that person. So let me pull up the deck here and we'll take a look at a couple of things from last time and then we'll push it a step forward. Why is that one not showing up? Hold on. Oh. Come on. There it is. Okay. So addressing substandard performance. So this is kind of a follow-up from last week's conversation. We're taking it a little further. That's why I'm just calling this number 2. I wanted to start off with a quote. Sheryl Sandberg of Lean In fame, if you read the book, one of the top leaders at Facebook for many years. Leadership is about making others better as a result of your presence and making sure that impact lasts in your absence. The reason I wanted to bring this quote to everyone's attention is many of the leaders that I've talked with who are running teams have this wonderful idea that if they bring somebody onto their team who did a lot in GCI last year, let's say, all we have to do is get them onto our team and just like let them loose in the world and they'll go do great things and we can just sit back and watch the money roll in and we don't have to actually do any work ourselves. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. If it were that simple, every team would be successful. Every agent would be successful for every team. It just doesn't work that simply. What we realize is that once we bring people onto the team, we're actually introducing some complexity into the operations of our business that can't be avoided. And that includes certain things like other people's interests, other people's motivations, even things that they may have in their lives that are competing with their interest to serve the business, like an aging parent that needs care or a child that's just been born or something like that, that gets in the way of the kind of performance that we're looking for. So we have to recognize that as leaders, it's not as simple as saying, here's somebody who did 100,000 in GCI last year. And if I just bring that person onto my team, I can just add that to my profit without having to expend anything. Right? The reality is that we bring a human being into this system that we already have, other human beings, and there's something that we're going to have to manage there. And so the art of leadership here is the art of being able to support those people to perform in the way that they need to perform so that we can step back a little bit from it and not necessarily have to deal with them all the time. So three parts of managing performance. We talked about these the first time. If you're going to have a performance management system, you need a couple of pieces to it. And these are some fundamental pieces that are necessary. You need to have a way of monitoring what it is people are doing that matters to the business, how much they're selling, how quickly they're working, perhaps working hours, whether they show up or not at meetings, whatever it is that's important to you in the performance of their work, you should have a way of monitoring that. Because if you don't monitor it, then you're just going by your gut. And sometimes our gut is not quite accurate as far as performance goes. Secondly, you need a way of assessing or evaluating what it is they're doing. And it can be a simple system, a spreadsheet where you write down the deliverables. We shared this before. You can write down the deliverables on the left-hand column and just check off a box or just write in next to it, above expectation, at expectation, or below expectation. Even something as simple as that gives you a quick snapshot and a way to think about where they're performing, where they're not performing, to make an assessment overall of their performance. And third, managing. That's the biggest part of it. When you find that a person is performing at below your expectations or below what the business requires, then the question is, okay, how do I respond to this as a leader? How do I manage this particular situation? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Managing options. There's 4 options when you decide something needs to be done. First, retrain. If you assess the person's performance as not adequate, and your conclusion is that the reason that they're not performing at the level that you would like them to is because they lack the training or the knowledge or the experience to do what's being asked of them, then your response as a leader is to retrain. That is, if they don't have the skills or knowledge to let's say, use Business Tracker, update Business Tracker for you, well, you need to retrain them. Maybe you need to send them to Compass Academy, or you can look at some of the old videos from Chirag Shah Coaching, any place where the person can get the skills that they need. That's retraining. So if the cause of the performance problem is about lack of knowledge or skills, it's about a retraining option to manage it. If, on the other hand, the person has the skills and knowledge, but they're still not performing at the right level, then you have to assess, are they really understanding the priority and importance of the issues in the same way you are? And what we often find is they don't. The reason that they don't show up in meetings is because they didn't think it was as important. When you mentioned it offhand and they thought it was just another thing like show up when you're able, but you really expect them to show up once a week with the meetings with everybody else. Or maybe, you told them to do 100 different things and updating the CRM was just one of them, and they thought it was kind of a lower priority, but for you, it was a higher priority, right? In each of these cases, it represents a misalignment of priority. And so in these cases, you need to realign. And that's what we'll talk about here in just a minute, about having the conversation to do that. Reassign. If the work that you've done to retrain them or to realign them still results in a failure to perform in the way that they like, or the way that you like, you need to consider reassigning them to something else. Either they don't have the skills, they're able to do that, or they don't have the will or the motivation or the interest, or they just don't understand the business the way that you do. It may be desirable for you to find another role for them. And sometimes that's the best solution. You know what? They're just not good in this particular role, but they do have some skills and some interest over here. Sometimes it works to reassign someone to another place on the team. If all of those things fail, then you have to release the person. They're just not a fit. If they can't perform in the way that the team needs, and you've made the effort to do one of these other 3 things and it hasn't worked out, that's where you release. So these are your 4 options. So next time you're reviewing someone's performance and you're analyzing, where it is they might be falling short, ask yourself, is it a skills or a knowledge issue? If so, the answer is retrain. If it's a different understanding of what the priorities are or what the expectations are, it's about realigning. If neither of those things are effective, then you can think about reassigning. And if that doesn't work, release. Those are your 4 options. So let's look at this second one here, realign. Realigning is when you have to have a conversation with someone about something that matters to the business that there seems to be some kind of a disconnect about. You expect performance to be here or in this form, but what you're getting is this. This represents a misalignment or a non-alignment between you and that other person. So what do we do about this? Well, we're going to have a conversation that you could consider as an intervention in a sense. It's an attempt to like short circuit or rewire the person thinking about the way the business ought to be or the way that the role should be performed so that you're both on the same page, coming into alignment. So how do you do that? Well, first you need to set up the conversation. You can set up the conversation first by making sure in your own mind that what it is you want to communicate to the person is clear. And this is why we introduced this deliverable last week. If you remember, we talked about this tool that you can use ahead of time to make sure that you're absolutely clear about what it is you expect of the person. It's not just that. There's, as you recall, there are a couple of pieces in there that is what's expected or required of you to help that person perform effectively. And so this is kind of a checklist or a way of running through the various aspects of the role so that you're clear in your mind before you start any conversation with the person. Of course, you can also use this in a case where you're about to hire a new person. When you're thinking about what is it I want this person to come in here and do, how can I spec out the requirements here? This particular tool is designed to help you answer some questions about that. Many people think it's adequate to just create a simple, job description, a list about 20 things, then hand it to the new employee and say, okay, go do this. Or some people don't even have it written down. It's just kind of in mind, right? The person comes in, you're hired, glad to have you with the team. I want you to do this, 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 this. You give them 28 things to do. They only remember 3 of them, and then off they go. And surprise, surprise, a couple of weeks later, you realize they're not doing things the way that you thought they would. And so this is really about how you're kind of contracting with them for what the role is. So this particular tool can be used for recontracting in a sense with someone who's already working for you, or it can be for somebody who you're about to bring onto the team, or a role you're considering to have someone come in and begin doing. So that's a step you have to take before you actually get into this realignment conversation. Amanda, I see a hand up there. Give me just a moment there. I'll get right to you. So in terms of setting up the conversation, we have to set up the conversation first, and then we navigate the conversation. The navigation of the conversation has 5 parts to it, and I'm going to take you through all 5 parts in a minute. We're going to give you a script that you can follow, or you can adapt to your own language. But the conversation is going to run through these 5 elements. When many people have conversations like this, they're missing 1 or 2 of these elements, or they're not approaching these elements in the right way. So you can see them listed here. Invite your colleague, make a dialogue, etc. We're going to show you another tool in just a minute that kind of like blows these out a little bit and gives you some language that you can use around each of these. So let me pull this down for now and answer Amanda's question. Amanda, please come off mute and let me know what's on your mind.
So I don't want to take up too much time, but when these situations come up, another thing that I didn't see on your list is the appropriate place to do this. I feel like that comes up a lot. We're really busy. We're sometimes in the moment and trying to figure out the best way to do this. I have a situation where another agent gave me feedback about my buyer's agent and gave very specific things. And so that I don't think we're good. And I have to have this conversation. And it's hard when sometimes these things happen, but you're not actually there to witness it.
Yep.
So I just wonder if maybe you could address that somewhere in your chat this morning, like how to address feedback that comes back that you also have to validate and get their side of the story as well.
Absolutely. I'll touch on that a little bit this morning, and I'm going to continue this dialogue next week where I'll talk a little bit more about that. What I want to do is kind of conclude this section of sessions on performance management by helping you think through next week, having a system for when these conversations can take place. One of the hard things to decide is when you do hear feedback from someone else about someone who works for you, whether it's an agent or an admin or anybody, what do you do with that, right? If the person had some kind of a unsatisfactory experience, what do? Well, certainly you want to get your person's side of the story because, feedback Remember that feedback that you receive from anybody is always grounded in their experience, their life, the shoes that they've walked in. And so some people might be highly sensitive to something because of something that they've experienced in the past, but actually it may not be that big a deal. On the other hand, it could well be. And so certainly that's one factor to think about. When you address it with the individual is another judgment call. And this is a big piece of effective leadership, is to know when's the right time for the person to hear what it is that you might want to say. So there's a fact-finding piece, and then there's like the message delivery piece. And they may not be at the same time, right? There may be a fact-finding conversation that you have with someone to hear their particular side of the story. And then maybe you think about it, or maybe you talk with someone else who was also there at the time, for example, and get their input. And then later on, perhaps you have a conversation with the person about what you'd like to happen going forward. Could be the next day, the next week, the next meeting, something like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, because that does align with one of the pieces I wanted to share with everybody. Just a quick note, Jenna's question here about should this also happen with a new agent? Absolutely. Everything we're talking about here is really about the concept of being on the same page about what the person's role is. Role isn't simply the job description. Job description usually lists, I want you to do this, 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 and this, or I want you to deliver this, 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 and this to the team. But the role sometimes is a little bit bigger than that. It might also include some other things that are not expressly listed there. And for example, on the sheet that I shared last week, there's something on there about working hours. You may have an expectation for the person's working hours, and often that's not listed in a job description, right? It might list, do this task, do this task, do this task, do this task. But very often the ones that I see don't say anything about working hours, for example. So a role generally includes more things than simply what's the job description. And so we need to think as leaders, what are all of the elements that are part of that person participating as a member of this community? Maybe it's you expect them to come to the team barbecue in the summer. You have a team barbecue every summer. It's a tradition. It's a part of how you do things. It's not written in the job description. It's not saying you will show up at the barbecue on July 28th, 2023, but it's an expectation that you have. So the point of this is we want to be on the same page with the person about what the role or the contribution is. And so this is true whether the person is a new employee who's going to be coming onto the team, you want to be clear at that point, or somebody who's on the team that you want to kind of make an adjustment. So let me pull up a document that we're going to share with you after today's session. Everything will be uploaded onto the platform. You can use this as a guide for a conversation you can have with someone whenever this need arises. Let me pull this one up. Okay, now this is listed as resetting a team member's role, but for those of you who are thinking of bringing someone on, you can adapt this slightly for the conversation that you would have for a new employee before he or she comes on, or just when they're coming on to the team. So just, adjust this appropriately. So these are the same, the numbered spots here are the same 5 numbers that were on that previous slide. I'll scroll through and you can see what the numbers are just again. The invitation, getting the team member's current perspective. This is in the case of resetting, of course. Envisioning the new role, agreeing on the new role or the new normal, and very crucially, agreeing on an assessment strategy. These are the 5 parts that this conversation ought to include. And when I ask people, how did they talk about resetting a role with an employee, they often leave out a couple of these pieces. So let's just go briefly through what these are. First of all, the invitation. When you have someone on your team that's not performing as you would wish, they may be aware of it, they may not be aware of it. It may be intentional, it may not be intentional. In any case, it's important for you to invite the person into the conversation rather than simply dictate, show up at my office 9 o'clock tomorrow, I have some things to tell you. So the invitation could be something simple as, hey, Susan, I'd like to talk with you about your role going forward so we can both be clear about what it is and how we can work together to make it a win-win for you and the team. Would you be willing to have that conversation with me? If the person says no, guess what? Out. They're not right for your team. Right there. That's it. I don't care what their GCI is. If they're not willing to have a conversation with you about their role to make sure it's a win-win for them and for the team, they're not right for your team. Sometimes we get lured by, great GCI numbers, or some friend we know recommends somebody. Oh yeah, I used to have this person as my admin. She was awesome. That's enough for us. But if the person's performance after they arrive and they work on the team for a while is not adequate, and they come up with an answer no to something like this, then no matter what their past history was, you have to have the courage to say, you know what, they're not right for my team right here, right now. So assuming the person says yes, 99.9% of the time, they'll say, yes, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. Then what happens when you come together to have that conversation? Is it, let me tell you how you need to run this role, how you need to lead yourself in this role? Or is there another way to approach it? Many of us are so anxious to make sure that they just do what we want them to do that we just burst right into, here's what I want you to do. Just listen to me and go do it and don't bother me, right? It's kind of like, I want to spend 5 minutes doing this and then I want to get you up to speed and then I don't want to think about you after this because I have other things to do, right? Not necessarily the most effective way to lead ourselves or our team. Another way you can do it is invite them into the conversation, because ultimately you need their motivation, you need their commitment to performing on whatever it is you agree on going forward in this conversation. And so invite them into the conversation by having them share their perspective. You could start off with something like, it's important to me to understand how things look from your perspective, so I have a list of questions I'd like to explore. This is about fact finding. This is not simply acting out of your own perception of how the person's performing, but it's being willing to be in a dialogue about how that person sees the job, because they may see it quite differently from you. And there might be some learnings in there. For example, what do you think your primary responsibilities are at this point? If you ask them to list the top 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever it is, you can see right there whether they see the overall priorities similarly to how you do or not. And if they don't, you can't just say it's their fault, right? As a leader, ultimately, if your team member doesn't understand what they need to be doing, whose responsibility is that? It's certainly not just theirs, right? It's your responsibility to make sure that your team members understand how it is they can contribute to the team, how it is they should contribute, what's expected of them, and anything else related to the role. Other questions: what is it you really like about your role and why? What is it you dislike and why? But these last 4 questions, these are questions where you might get some real insight into how the work looks from your employee's point of view. What am I doing that's making things easier for you? What am I doing that's making your job more difficult? Where am I communicating clearly? Where am I not? This is saying I have a role in your success, and I also can recognize that I may be doing something that's preventing your success. Doesn't mean you're taking on blame for that person's lack of execution. Absolutely not. But it is saying, I'm not here to simply dictate to you, my way or the highway, and that's the only way that this relationship can work. Remember that what relationship means is being able to have the relationship on both people's terms, right? Doesn't matter what the relationship is, whether you're married to somebody, whether it's a business partner. If the relationship is fully based on one person's terms and not at all on the other, we could say it's not a relationship at all. And so by asking these kinds of questions, you may find something that you're doing that, you just weren't very clear with the person. You thought you were, but maybe you weren't, at least from his or her point of view. So spend a little time in the conversation trying to understand what the world looks like from that person's point of view. Because once you have that, it becomes much easier to have the next part of the conversation. So part 3, envisioning the new role. This is where you're going to scope out or rescope out what things are going to look like going forward. And you can start with a simple sentence. Let's think about what your role could look like going forward and why. Or you could say, let's think about what your role should look like going forward and why. Now, I should point out that after you have this particular number 2 part of the conversation, you might want to pause. You might want to say, you know what? You've told me a lot. This is really helpful to me. Let me think about it. And can we come back tomorrow or next week or whenever and figure out how we're going to go forward with this role? Because you may need to think through some things in your desire to solve the problem as quickly as possible. You might want to race right into, what's going on with that. How do we rejigger this role? But if you learn something in this second part of the conversation, it may be necessary for you to take a little time to sort through it, to think about it, maybe talk to a trusted advisor or someone else on the team, and then come back with the next part. So the next part, envisioning the new role, is all about recognizing whatever we learned in the second part of the conversation and kind of like feeding that into where we go from here. So now let's think about what your role could look like going forward. And so again, this is a very interactive dialogue. It doesn't mean you're giving up power. It doesn't mean you're giving up authority. It means ultimately that you're going to have a conversation where you still retain the final kind of decision on any of this stuff, but also it's an opportunity for that other person to be involved in it. Let's think about what your role could look like going forward and why. What are some things you'd like to consider changing? What would you like to keep the same, et cetera? What could I do differently? What else do you need more clarity on? An opportunity to think about how the specific elements of that person's role come into specific form. I want you to be showing houses. I want you to be showing houses in these particular districts. Or I want you to be updating the CRM after you talk with your clients every time, something like that. To answer Jenna's question, yes, this particular conversation can be adapted, whether the person is a full-time employee, whether the person's an ICA. Don't get hung up on the idea that this person's an ICA and I can't really expect this person to do anything. Yes, they're an independent contractor, but you know what? You work with lots of people who are independent contractors, right? All your vendors, in a sense, are independent contractors too. It doesn't mean you can't have a dialogue about how you guys can collaborate with each other. So envisioning the new role is understanding your answers to questions like these. And it's not just these questions, but these are just some suggestions to recognize going forward what it is that we could have this role like built around. And then you need to agree on what that is. So whatever the items are that come up as part of the new understanding or the new alignment about what the person's going to be spending his time or her time on, then it's like solidifying that. So agreeing on the new normal, you could start with something like, thanks for sharing all your thoughts about it. It's really important for us to be on the same page moving forward about what you'll be doing, how I can support you. So based on our previous discussion, I've created this list of responsibilities for each of us. So this is where you've kind of like solidified. This is what you're going to be expected to provide here. This is what I'm expected to provide here. It's not a contract. We're not signing a contract that says I'll sue you if you don't do number 4, or you'll sue me if I don't do number 3. It's not about that, but you're in business together. This is a business endeavor. You're both choosing to be a part of success here. And so it's about being clear and on the same page, or as we say, aligned around what it is each of you is going to provide in the relationship. And an important part of this is you're being willing to acknowledge how it is you're going to provide support to this individual. Maybe you'll pay for this person's training. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll agree to make 30 minutes a week to talk with this person about how things are going to help solve problems. Maybe you'll make some of the business's assets available to this person in one way or another. You need to understand, of course, that it's a two-way street. It's a business arrangement where each of you has a particular set of responsibilities. Part 5, last one. This is really important. It almost never happens in these conversations. Agreeing on an assessment strategy. The point here is, once we agree on this today, do we just like let it go forever and expect it to be perfect? Because that's how we got to where we were before this conversation, right? In almost every business, if you just let things run, sooner or later, they're going to get a little bit more the concept of entropy, which is like the natural movement from order to disorder. That's, of course, what happens in business. It's why all managers, all leaders of every business have to keep people focused on the right kinds of things. We have to keep talking and reinforce certain messages, something like that. And so an assessment strategy is an agreement that you'll have about when you'll revisit this conversation and maybe how you'll do that, so that you can make sure that we're still on the straight and narrow with each other going forward. If you don't have that, I guarantee you over time, you'll be back in the same situation again. Something you talked about today will be either misunderstood or more likely forgotten over time by one of you. And then we're right back in the same situation where we're not getting the performance that we expect. So these particular steps, these 5 steps, inviting the person in, getting their perspective on the role currently, envisioning the new role together, agreeing on what that role is going to be specifically, and agreeing on an assessment strategy gives you a really great opportunity to be clear and stay clear with each other going forward. So who has a question about any of this? If you have a question, throw it into the chat box. I'll try to answer it quickly, so we're almost out of time. But this script will be available to everybody shortly on the platform. Yes, I like Scott's comment. It's about what the relationship looks like if things are going well. It's really quite simple in concept. If this person is doing all of these things and the other person is doing all of these things, we get maximum value out of the relationship. And that's the purpose of the relationship, right? Everybody you bring into your team is an attempt to get maximum value out of the relationship between the two of you, or the relationship that that person has with someone else on the team. It's always the same thing. How do we create maximum value as separate individuals with a common goal? And if you're not aligned with anyone on your team, chances are there's a loss factor there. You're leaving money on the table. So for those of you who don't have any written job descriptions, I strongly advise you to clarify that stuff. For those of you who may see some of your people performing, either people who are ICAs or people who you're paying a salary to, not performing the way you'd like or the way that you think you agreed to, there's an opportunity to tighten that up. And when you do, then you theoretically, you open or you capture the maximum possible productivity from that relationship. I see Amanda here talking about this book called Radical Candor. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about feedback next time. There are some famous companies out there that base their culture on feedback. And most of us in America, I've worked with people in every industry from, Fortune 500 companies with 200,000 employees down to small startups to nonprofits. We have a problem with these kinds of conversations in general. We don't want to create conflict. We don't want to create pain within the team. We're not sure how the person's going to react. We think they might get defensive. All these things steer us to not having the conversation. And unfortunately, what that means is we are agreeing to have less than ideal performance or success with our team because we're concerned or we're not sure how to handle a particular tricky situation like that. So with the two tools we've shared so far, there should be some help for you there, absolutely, for everybody in having these conversations. Next time, we're going to have a conversation around setting up kind of a unified system of conversations so that these things can be rare rather than frequent. So thank you, everybody, for being with us this morning. Look forward to seeing you next week. Look forward to seeing you in Atlanta when we all get there. Have a great day. Go out and make the contribution that only you can make. Have a good one, everyone.